At the northeastern edge of the post-war map, where the ruins of civilization give way to the restless Atlantic, there lies an island, shrouded in mist and memory. Far Harbor, once a modest fishing community off the coast of Maine, its isolation spared it from the full inferno of atomic fire, yet condemned it to a slower, more insidious decay. The Great War's shockwaves reached it all the same, carried not only by radiation and fallout, but by the collapse of every tether that bound humanity together. Here, amid the jagged rocks and drowned forests, the ocean itself became a participant in the long dying of the world. Each tide brought not salvation but corrosion. Ships turned to skeletons, shorelines swallowed by creeping contamination, and a fog thicker than the conscience of the wasteland that would soon come to define the island's fate. The harbormen who survived the first years after the bombs did so not through strength of arms or the aid of distant powers, but through a stubborn ritual of endurance, holding on to their ancestral trade, fishing, as if routine could ward off extinction. They built their lives around what little remained. Rusted trawlers converted into homes, generators scavenged from half-sunken facilities, and crude defenses erected against both the beasts of the land and the madness of isolation. To the rest of the wasteland, Far Harbor might as well not have existed. To those who lived there, it was the last redoubt of a people who refused to vanish. The geography of the island itself is a study in contradiction, rugged and beautiful, lethal yet alive. Its cliffs, battered for centuries by relentless tides, conceal coves of almost pre-war tranquility, while its forests, once green with pine and birch, now fester under the influence of radiation and decay. The air hums faintly with residual energy, and at dawn, when the sun's rays attempt to pierce the ever-present mists, they illuminate a landscape caught between two worlds, the living and the long dead. In this liminal place, the laws of nature have bent, but not broken. The fog, both literal and symbolic, dominates the island's rhythm. It is more than weather, a sentient phenomenon to those who endure it, breathing and shifting like a great animal. To the harbormen, it is both a curse and a test, a reminder that survival demands reverence as much as resistance. No one truly knows its origin, whether it seeped from the ocean's depths, from ancient reactors beneath the waves, or from the unseen hand of some divine punishment. The few records that survived the war mention experimental naval installations and research facilities along Maine's coast, their purposes lost to classified files and collapsing infrastructure. Whatever the truth, the fog came to embody the spiritual core of Far Harbor's existence, a veil between the known and the unknowable. Generations after the bombs, the descendants of the original survivors came to regard the fog as a living adversary. Their ancestors had learned to read the ocean's moods, to navigate by stars and currents, yet no compass could guide them through this shifting grey labyrinth. It rolled across the island unpredictably, swallowing entire trails and devouring landmarks, leaving only the faint wail of foghorns to remind the living that others still breathed somewhere beyond sight. Exposure meant death, not swiftly, but through corrosion of body and mind. The mutated wildlife of the island thrived within it. Creatures shaped by radiation and hunger, their forms grotesque reflections of the pre-war fauna. Anglers, gulper beasts, and fog crawlers, predators of unnatural resilience, prowled the mists, making travel and trade near impossible. The harbormen adapted by fortifying their settlement with layers of steel and scavenged plating, sealing themselves behind walls as though the fog itself were a besieging army. Their speech grew sharp and insular, their customs practical to the crime, point of fatalism. Outsiders were treated with suspicion, not from cruelty, but from necessity. On an island where every mistake could feed the sea or the fog, trust became a currency too rare to spend freely. To understand Far Harbor is to understand isolation, cut off from the mainland by distance and the lethal weather of the post-nuclear Atlantic. The island evolved its own rhythm, untouched by the empires rising and falling elsewhere, the new California Republic's bureaucracy, the Brotherhood's crusades, even the Institute's secret dominion. The Harbormen neither sought nor received aid. Their economy remained primitive by wasteland standards. Trade in fish, tools, and the occasional shipment of scavenged metal exchanged along dangerous coastal routes. Power was rationed, technology limited to what could be repaired or repurposed from old-world wrecks. In this context, the people developed a peculiar identity, not nostalgic for the pre-war world, but contemptuous of it. Where other survivors clung to the ruins of civilization, the Harbormen saw the past as a false promise. The ocean had endured long before mankind built its cities, and so they sought to endure as well, adopting a creed closer to natural law than ideology. Their speech carried the rhythms of seafarers, their songs and prayers laced with both reverence and resentment for the sea that fed and punished them. They believed, in their marrow, that the world had ended not in an instant of fire, but in a slow drowning, a truth that the fog confirmed each day. Yet the isolation that preserved Far Harbor also drew the attention of those who viewed it differently. For some, the island represented a frontier untouched by the politics of the mainland, a blank slate for new belief. Long before the sole survivors' arrival, whispers spread of pilgrims and zealots making their way north, following the pull of what they called the glow. They were the children of Atom, a faith born in the radioactive ruins of the old world, venerating the atom not as a weapon, but as a divine force of creation and transformation. To them, the fog was sacred proof of Atom's presence, a manifestation of holy power that embraced decay as rebirth. Their eventual arrival on the island would ignite one of the most complex and tragic conflicts in the post-war era. But that story begins later. In these early years, the Harbormen stood alone, unaware that their island would soon become a crucible for the ideologies of man and machine alike. For now, their struggle was simple: to keep the fog at bay, to maintain the dim light of their settlement, and to fish the poisoned waters that had sustained their ancestors. The sea itself plays a silent role in Far Harbor's history, both as sustainer and destroyer. Long before the Great War, the Gulf of Maine had been an economic artery, feeding the pre-war world's appetite for industry and consumption. After the bombs, it became a graveyard of ships and oil platforms, their twisted remains forming reefs that altered currents and ecosystems. Radiation mixed with the salt water, producing strange blooms of luminescent algae and mutated fish, both a source of food and disease. The Harbormen learned which catches were safe, which were lethal, and which could be traded as curiosities to rare visitors from the mainland. This maritime expertise became their survival's cornerstone. The settlement of Far Harbor grew slowly, its leadership informal, guided by a council of elders and captains whose authority came from skill rather than decree. They developed defenses against the fog, rudimentary condensers at first, mechanical attempts to push back the encroaching mists. These devices, fragile and temperamental, represented the first intersection between desperation and ingenuity, a theme that would define the island's future technological evolution. Though they could not have known it, the Harbormen's isolation was never complete. signals still pulsed through the ether, remnants of pre-war transmissions bouncing between satellites, ghostly radio echoes carrying fragments of a dead civilization. Occasionally, a trader or scavenger would reach the island, bringing stories of far-off lands where humanity was rebuilding or destroying itself anew. These tales were met with skepticism. The Harbormen's reality was bounded by the fog, and anything beyond it felt more myth than fact. In this way, Far Harbor became both a literal and psychological frontier, the end of the known world. To live there was to accept that no help would come, that the sea and the fog were not obstacles to be conquered, but constants to be endured. Over time, that endurance hardened into identity. Children were taught not only to fish and fight, but to navigate by intuition, to read the subtle shifts in the fog's movement, to sense when the island itself seemed to breathe. In the centuries after the war, Far Harbor stood as one of the few functioning communities in the wasteland without allegiance to any greater power. Its people neither expanded nor retreated, they simply persisted. The fog, however, was patient, and with each passing year, it crept closer. By the time the world would come to rediscover this forgotten corner of Maine, the balance between human tenacity and environmental hostility had reached its breaking point. The stage was set for a convergence of faith, of technology, and of moral ambiguity that would soon define not only the fate of the island, but the meaning of survival itself. The story of Far Harbor as a community begins long before the fog came to define its identity, rooted in the simple yet perilous act of survival along Maine's rugged coastline in the aftermath of nuclear devastation, a time when the remnants of civilization were scattered and tenuous, and every decision carried the weight of life or death. For those who first returned to the island sought not wealth or power but the basic assurance of existence, guided by instinct, maritime knowledge, and the faint echoes of a world that had ceased to exist. And it was along the jagged cliffs and sheltered bays that these early settlers, later known as the Harbormen, carved out a precarious life, relying upon fishing as both sustenance and currency in a land stripped of functioning institutions, where pre-war money had become worthless, and trade with the mainland was fraught with both distance and danger, for the Atlantic, though it could provide, also punished with storms, tides, and remnants of pre-war contamination that transformed familiar currents into unpredictable threats, shaping both the geography of their settlement and the culture that emerged from it. And in this harsh crucible, the first rudimentary homes arose, shelters built from the skeletons of wrecked trawlers, driftwood, and the rusted remnants of pre-war structures, creating clusters of habitations in coves that offered some protection from both the sea and the relentless winds, where families huddled together and shared resources, establishing communal bonds that would define the Harbormen's social structure for generations. And these early pioneers quickly recognized that survival on the island depended not only on physical endurance, but on knowledge passed down from those who had lived close to the ocean before the bombs, for they had to understand tidal patterns, the habits of fish, the foraging of edible plants amidst mutated undergrowth, and the rhythms of weather that could turn a calm bay into a maelstrom capable of obliterating both livelihood and life. And thus the first settlers became stewards of a precarious equilibrium, balancing extraction and sustainability, learning which species of fish and shellfish could be safely consumed and which had been altered by radiation into hazards. And in so doing, they established the foundations of a unique economy that would continue to evolve in parallel with the island's gradual population growth a society built not upon the accumulation of wealth, but upon the careful management of resources essential to human life, with the ocean as both provider and constant reminder of their vulnerability. The earlier settlement patterns reflect the dual imperatives of defense and practicality. For the Harbormen understood that isolation offered both sanctuary and threat. In establishing clusters along the sheltered coves, they created defensible positions against wildlife mutated by the nuclear fallout, such as fog crawlers and giant, aggressive anglerfish that roamed the forested coastline and underwater terrain, creatures whose forms bore little resemblance to their pre-war ancestors, and whose predation forced humans to develop not only weapons, but strategies for vigilance and mobility, while simultaneously maintaining access to the sea routes critical for fishing and trade, however limited, and over time, these clusters coalesced into the nucleus of a village that would eventually bear the name Far Harbor, a settlement whose identity was inseparable from the physical and ecological conditions of the island, and whose culture would be defined as much by necessity as by inherited tradition, combining the remnants of pre-war maritime knowledge with improvisation, intuition, and the constant negotiation with both environment and mutation, giving rise to a way of life that valued expertise, communal cooperation, and a profound understanding of the natural forces at play, which, although hostile, were predictable enough to be mastered, at least partially, by those who devoted themselves to learning the island's rhythms. Leadership in the early settlement was informal, based less on hierarchy than on demonstrated skill and experience, with captains of the few surviving trawlers, elder fishermen, and skilled hunters acting as de facto advisors, mediators, and enforcers, their authority earned through competence and the respect of their peers rather than by decree, and it was this pragmatic governance that allowed the settlement to survive its formative decades, as disputes over food, shelter, and fishing grounds could have easily escalated into fatal conflict, if not tempered by a shared understanding of scarcity and the consequences of mismanagement. And in these circumstances, social cohesion became inseparable from survival, instilling values that emphasized collective responsibility, restraint, and ingenuity, fostering traditions that blended the vestiges of pre-war cultural memory with innovations born entirely of necessity, such as methods of preserving fish in a climate where refrigeration was impossible, techniques for repurposing shipwrecks into dwellings or storage facilities, and the construction of rudimentary defenses from salvaged metal and timber, which would later form the archetypal architecture of the Harbormen's village. Low, dense structures oriented toward the sea, built for protection against wind, fog, and wildlife, yet designed with an eye toward utility, efficiency, and minimal waste, reflecting the intersection of human resilience and environmental adaptation. The economy of the emerging settlement mirrored this philosophy of adaptation, relying on a mix of subsistence and barter that was entirely divorced from pre-war monetary systems, which had become meaningless and instead based upon tangible, immediately valuable commodities: fresh fish, preserved foodstuffs, clean water, ammunition, simple tools, and later, the occasional trinket or salvageable technology scavenged from shipwrecks and abandoned installations along the coast, forming a rudimentary trade network that, while local in scope, established patterns of exchange and interdependence that would become hallmarks of the Harbormen's culture. In this early period, trade was both necessity and social glue, a way of distributing risk, fostering trust, and reinforcing communal bonds, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for more complex economic and political interactions in the centuries to follow, and although initially limited to barter between families and small groups, these interactions created the first seeds of governance, social norms, and reputation-based authority that would later evolve into a more formalized village structure. Cultural adaptation went hand in hand with economic innovation, for the Harbormen developed rituals and practices that reinforced knowledge and skill, such as teaching young people to navigate both sea and forest, to recognize dangerous mutations, and to manage communal resources. And these practices were often codified into informal laws and expectations, enforced not by formal authority, but by social pressure and the ever-present consequences of failure. For in a place like Far Harbor, mistakes could be fatal, and survival depended upon both adherence to collective wisdom and the ability to improvise when conditions shifted unexpectedly, which they often did. As the post-war ecosystem of the island was dynamic and unpredictable, shaped by radiation, climate, and mutation, producing both opportunities and dangers that would continue to influence the settlement for generations. The physical environment itself imposed constraints that shaped both daily life and long-term planning, for the island's rugged terrain, unpredictable tides, and narrow inlets limited expansion, forcing settlers to prioritize strategic locations for dwellings, lookouts, and supply caches, and simultaneously fostering a culture of careful observation and environmental literacy, as the ability to anticipate weather changes, animal behavior, and even the subtle encroachment of the fog could mean the difference between life and death. And it was this intimate connection to the land and sea that became central to the Harbormen identity, instilling a respect for forces larger than themselves, a practical spirituality rooted in survival rather than ideology, and a worldview in which every action was measured against both immediate necessity and long-term endurance, setting the stage for the philosophical and practical conflicts that would later define Far Harbor's history. As the settlement stabilized, so too did the human population, and despite the absence of pre-war infrastructure, schools, or formal governance, a coherent community emerged, bound by mutual dependence, environmental mastery, and a shared understanding of the island's limitations and resources. And it was during this period that the patterns of Far Harbor life crystallized into what would become its defining traits: resilience, pragmatism, and an acceptance of risk as a constant companion, balanced by ingenuity, communal care, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually allow the settlement to endure for decades despite isolation, the ever-present fog, and the growing attention of external ideologies and forces, from mainland scavengers to the arrival of the children of Atom, whose eventual presence would challenge the Harbormen's worldview, yet whose arrival centuries later would have its roots in this very culture of survival, adaptation, and intimate knowledge of the island's unique ecology, demonstrating that the birth of Far Harbor was not simply the act of founding a settlement, but the creation of a society perfectly attuned to a world that had ended, and a landscape that demanded respect, vigilance, and a willingness to endure beyond hope, establishing the foundation upon which every later struggle, spiritual, political, and technological, would unfold. The island of Far Harbor, seemingly isolated from the mainland and buffered by its rugged coastline, gradually became defined not only by its rocky terrain, dense forests, and ocean-bound isolation, but by an ever-present phenomenon that would come to dominate both the physical and cultural landscape: the fog. a persistent, radioactive haze that rolled over the island like a living entity, mysterious in origin and devastating in effect, transforming the island from a mere maritime refuge into a crucible of survival and ideological conflict. For while the early Harbormen had learned to master the rhythms of the ocean and the land, the fog was unpredictable, unyielding, and in many ways intelligent in its movement, creeping inland with a slow inevitability that forced the population to reconsider every aspect of daily life. From fishing and foraging to the construction of dwellings and defensive positions, and the phenomenon itself became the defining constant of Far Harbor, shaping both the settlement's economy and its philosophy. For unlike other regions of the post-war wasteland, the fog was not merely a byproduct of residual radiation or environmental decay, but an active, semi-sentient presence that interacted with the natural world, accelerating mutations in flora and fauna, altering the chemistry of water and soil, and creating conditions under which ordinary fish could become monstrous, and plants could twist into new, sometimes hazardous forms, making survival an ongoing negotiation with a world that was simultaneously familiar and alien. And it was within this relentless miasma that the human story of Far Harbor became inseparable from the story of the island itself, for the fog was both threat and teacher, a constant measure of resilience that forced innovation, adaptation, and an intimate understanding of the land that went beyond mere survival. The arrival of the fog was gradual, perceptible first as a shifting haze along the coast, then as a rolling wall of grey that swallowed landmarks, muffled sound, and disoriented travelers, creating a psychological effect as potent as the physical danger it posed. For the harbormen learned quickly that the fog was a zone of both death and transformation, where exposure could lead to acute radiation sickness, irreversible mutations, or, in some cases, death by drowning or predation, as the land itself became unrecognizable. And over time, the phenomenon shaped both individual behavior and collective strategy, for no longer could fishing parties venture freely into coves without careful planning. No longer could scouts or hunters operate without detailed knowledge of currents, wind patterns, and the locations of mutated predators, and the community's spatial awareness became acute as every inch of land, every inlet, and every trail was memorized in relation to the fog's unpredictable movements, creating a living map in the minds of those who endured it. A mental cartography that was constantly updated with each shift in weather, tide, or visibility, a necessity for survival that became culturally encoded, forming part of the unwritten education passed from elders to youth, a knowledge system in which caution was wisdom and miscalculation was often fatal. The fog also had profound ecological effects, interacting with both terrestrial and marine ecosystems to produce the distinctive environmental conditions of Far Harbor, and it was through these effects that the island's unique identity was forged. For radiation carried on the haze altered the behavior, size, and physiology of native and introduced species alike, producing creatures that would dominate the island for generations, such as giant anglerfish lurking in underwater caves, massive fog crawlers patrolling forest floors, and mutated deer and birds whose unpredictability created hazards for travelers and subsistence hunters alike. And the presence of these altered species necessitated both technological and tactical adaptation, from the development of improvised weapons and traps to the construction of elevated walkways, lookout towers, and fortified observation posts that allowed Harbormen to safely navigate the terrain while maintaining access to food and resources. And, in these adaptations, one sees the intimate dialogue between humanity and environment, where every innovation is both a response to threat and a reflection of the human capacity for resilience and ingenuity. Equally significant was the fog's impact on culture and belief, for it became the central phenomenon around which myths, ideologies, and religious interpretations would emerge. Long before the children of Atom arrived in force, locals had begun to regard the fog as an agent of judgment, a living test of skill, courage, and moral fortitude, and these beliefs became enmeshed with practical survival knowledge, creating a worldview in which the supernatural and the material were inseparable. For what could be learned from experience was always colored by the palpable threat of the fog, and as generations passed, the haze itself took on a quasi-religious significance, influencing rituals, taboos, and daily practices, shaping the rhythms of work, rest, and movement, and embedding the environmental reality of Far Harbor into the moral and spiritual consciousness of its inhabitants, so that the landscape and its hazards were understood not merely as obstacles to overcome, but as integral participants in human life, a constant reminder that mastery of the island required respect, observation, and humility. The physical characteristics of the fog itself defied simple categorization, presenting as a dense, gray cloud that could reduce visibility to mere meters, yet carrying chemical and radiological properties that penetrated both flesh and mind, producing nausea, dizziness, and the gradual onset of radiation poisoning, with chronic exposure leading to mutations or death if not mitigated by protective measures, which were limited in the early years to rudimentary shelters, improvised masks, and protective clothing scavenged from pre-war materials, and later, technological interventions such as condensers and pumps designed to locally disperse or filter the haze, representing one of the earliest intersections of human ingenuity with the island's unique environmental challenges, and these efforts were often perilous, requiring constant maintenance, experimentation, and courage, for any failure could result in rapid contamination of living areas or loss of critical resources, emphasizing the constant negotiation between technological ambition and ecological reality that characterized Far Harbor's evolution. Beyond the immediate physical and ecological consequences, the fog had profound implications for the social and economic life of the Harbormen, for travel became constrained, trade limited, and the population forced into denser, more defensible settlements, which in turn fostered new social norms around cooperation, hierarchy, and resource management, with authority frequently emerging from those who demonstrated competence in both navigation and survival, rather than traditional pre-war metrics of status or wealth. And over time, this created a community deeply tied to its environment, where the measure of a person's value was directly linked to their ability to anticipate, adapt to, and mitigate the dangers of the fog, and where knowledge, ecological, tactical, and technical, became the primary form of capital, passed orally from one generation to the next, in a tradition that emphasized observation, experimentation, and communal validation, ensuring that survival was a shared endeavor rather than an individual pursuit, and that every member of the society had a role to play in maintaining the fragile equilibrium between human habitation and environmental hazard. The appearance of the fog also drew the attention of outside forces, both human and ideological, laying the groundwork for the arrival of the children of Atom, a faith that interpreted the radioactive mists not as a threat, but as a divine gift, a manifestation of holy energy that validated their doctrines and justified expansion, and the arrival of such groups would radically alter the trajectory of the island, introducing conflict over territory, resources, and belief. Yet even before their physical arrival, the fog itself had begun to shape the philosophical landscape of Far Harbor, prompting reflection on human fragility, mortality, and the relationship between survival and moral choice. For the hazards of the environment necessitated decisions that could have immediate consequences for life and death, reinforcing a worldview in which ethical and practical considerations were inseparable, and survival demanded both ingenuity and prudence. In sum, the coming of the fog transformed Far Harbor from a simple maritime refuge into a locus of ecological, cultural, and philosophical significance, a living laboratory in which humans, mutations, and environmental forces interacted continuously, producing a society defined by adaptation, resilience, and reverence for the forces beyond their control. And this early encounter with the fog set the stage for all subsequent events on the island. The rise of the Children of Atom, the establishment of Acadia as a haven for synths, the technological interventions and conflicts that would define local power, and the eventual moral and ideological crossroads that would confront any visitor, including the sole survivor. Centuries after the first settlers first learned to coexist with this unrelenting, semi-sentient presence. And in this way, the fog is not merely a hazard, but the central character in the story of Far Harbor, shaping not only the physical landscape, but the very identity of its inhabitants and their descendants. The arrival of the Children of Atom on Far Harbor marked a profound turning point in the island's history, transforming it from a place defined solely by human adaptation to one in which ideology, faith, and radical interpretations of radiation and decay would shape every aspect of society. For long before their physical settlement, the Harbormen had contended with the environment as their primary adversary and teacher. But with the introduction of this devout and expansionist group, survival became intertwined with moral and philosophical confrontation, and the children of this faith, emerging from the wider post-war world, carried with them beliefs that were as potent as the fog itself. A doctrine rooted in the worship of atomic energy as a divine force, a faith that interpreted the radiation which had claimed so much of the world as not merely a destructive agent, but as a source of creation, transformation, and spiritual enlightenment. And in doing so, they positioned themselves not as ordinary survivors, but as emissaries of a cosmic will, whose vision of the world demanded both reverence and conformity. And upon arrival to Far Harbor, they sought not merely to inhabit the island, but to assert dominion over the manifestations of the fog, interpreting its omnipresence as evidence that Atom had chosen the island as a sacred site, a hallowed ground where the faithful could commune directly with the divine, and where ordinary human practice was subordinate to the dictates of holy radiation. And this ideology, while alien and threatening to the pragmatic Harbormen, was deeply persuasive to some, for it offered explanation, purpose, and certainty in a world otherwise defined by randomness, mutation, and death, transforming the physical landscape into a theater of theological significance. And the settlement patterns of the Children of Atom, culminating in the construction of the nucleus, were carefully designed not only to establish their presence, but to manifest. Their religious devotion in stone, metal, and ritual space, elevating sacred precincts above ordinary dwellings and creating a tangible expression of faith that the Harbormen could neither ignore nor tolerate in simple indifference. The children of Atom approached the island not as a single monolithic entity, but as a network of zealots bound by shared doctrine and a willingness to enforce it through both persuasion and coercion, traveling by small fleets and using scavenged technology to establish positions strategically, often occupying areas where the fog was densest, interpreting its thick, radioactive mists as a sign of Atom's blessing, and in doing so, they created zones that were effectively off-limits to the Harbormen, forcing the indigenous population to contend with both environmental hazards and ideological incursion. And while initial interactions may have included cautious observation, negotiation, and tentative trade, the inherent differences between pragmatic, survivalism, and apocalyptic faith quickly surfaced, producing tension, miscommunication, and occasional violent confrontation. For the children regarded the island not as a neutral space to be shared, but as sacred territory to be consecrated and defended, and the Harbormen, whose society had been defined by careful balance with the environment rather than ideological absolutism, could not accept domination by forces that threatened their autonomy, livelihoods, and the delicate equilibrium that had sustained them for generations. And thus, the arrival of the children of Atom transformed the social, political, and moral dimensions of Far Harbor, layering conflict upon survival in a way that would resonate for decades. Central to the children of Atom's establishment on Far Harbor was the nucleus, a fortified complex whose construction was both practical and symbolic, built on elevated ground and reinforced with scavenged metal and stone to withstand both environmental hazards and potential hostility. And within this space, rituals and practices were codified, ranging from offerings to Atom in the form of irradiated objects to communal gatherings that reinforced the cohesion and hierarchy of the group. And these practices were both overt and subtle, influencing patterns of movement across the island, delineating zones of sacred and profane space, and creating invisible boundaries that dictated where and how individuals might travel, fish, or forage, essentially overlaying a theological map atop the already complex geographical and ecological systems of Far Harbor. And it was in this manner that faith became a regulating force, shaping daily life, labor allocation, and even the interpretation of environmental phenomena. For the dense fog itself was no longer merely a natural hazard, but a sacred signifier, its movement and behavior interpreted as messages, tests, or judgments, and failure to recognize or respect these signals could lead not only to practical harm, but to spiritual condemnation, reinforcing the authority of the children of Atom and embedding their worldview into the material and cognitive fabric of the island. The philosophical implications of their arrival were as significant as the physical and social changes they imposed, for the children of Atom represented a radical reinterpretation of post-apocalyptic reality, one that inverted the conventional association of radiation with death, and instead positioned it as sacred energy, capable of cleansing, empowering, and transforming. And this redefinition of value, danger, and morality challenged the Harbormen to reconsider not only their approach to survival, but their assumptions about the nature of the world, the purpose of suffering, and the relationship between humans and the environment. And while the majority of Harbormen resisted conversion or adherence to these beliefs, the mere presence of a group whose worldview legitimized the fog's omnipresence forced all inhabitants of the island to integrate a new dimension of risk and moral calculation into their daily routines, balancing the practical demands of fishing, shelter, and security with the recognition that certain zones, actions, or behaviors might be interpreted as sacrilegious or confrontational, carrying consequences that extended beyond the immediate physical realm into social, spiritual, and political spheres. In the early decades after their settlement, the children of Atom expanded their influence gradually, consolidating power through both recruitment and demonstration of technological prowess, for they possessed knowledge of residual pre-war systems, rudimentary electronics, and defensive construction that gave them advantages in both survival and enforcement, and they leveraged these capabilities to assert control over key areas of the island, including elevated vantage points, caves, and coastal access routes. And in doing so, they effectively created a dual sovereignty alongside the Harbormen, producing a tense equilibrium in which neither group could fully dominate the other, yet both were compelled to coexist within the ecological, social, and spiritual confines imposed by the fog, the terrain, and the limited resources of Far Harbor. And it was this coexistence, punctuated by negotiation, skirmishes, and occasional cooperation, that laid the groundwork for later interactions with outside parties, including the arrival of Dima, Acadia, and ultimately the sole survivor, whose intervention centuries later would determine the fate of these competing visions for the island. Yet even before these future events, the establishment of the Children of Atom fundamentally redefined the island's identity, embedding faith, ritual, and theological conflict into the cultural DNA of Far Harbor, ensuring that survival was no longer purely a matter of skill and endurance, but also of alignment, recognition, and negotiation with forces that were simultaneously human, environmental, and divine. The arrival of the Children of Atom also had significant ecological consequences, as their practices often involved manipulation of local resources in ways that interacted with both the mutated flora and fauna and the persistent fog. For example, they established sacrificial zones, altered foraging patterns, and encouraged or tolerated certain mutations as sacred manifestations of Atom's power, creating micro-ecosystems in which predation, radiation, and human intervention coexisted in highly specific patterns. And these interventions further complicated the Harbormen's efforts to maintain food security, safety, and navigational knowledge, requiring a level of strategic planning and observation that went beyond previous generations' experience, and embedding the religious ideology of the newcomers into the very ecology of the island, in effect, transforming Far Harbor into a hybrid environment in which the physical, cultural, and spiritual dimensions were inseparable, each influencing the other in complex feedback loops that defined opportunity, risk, and meaning. By the time the Children of Atom had fully established the nucleus, fortified their positions, and consolidated followers, Far Harbor had become a landscape of moral, practical, and ecological contestation with multiple authorities: the pragmatic Harbormen, the devout Atomites, and, later, eventually, synthetic intermediaries in Acadia, all negotiating their place within a finite and challenging environment. And the arrival of the children represented the first truly ideological challenge the island had faced, transforming what had been primarily a struggle against nature into a struggle between competing visions of survival, faith, and purpose, a transformation that would ripple forward through every subsequent generation and encounter, ensuring that the island's history, identity, and moral complexity were inseparable from this moment, when devotion, ingenuity, and resilience collided beneath the omnipresent fog, and the island's fate became bound not only to human endurance, but to belief, ideology, and the consequences of faith made manifest in a landscape already defined by extremity, mutation, and environmental hazard. The emergence of Far Harbor as a contested space was defined as much by ideological divergence as by environmental hazard, for the arrival and settlement of the children of Atom introduced a worldview in stark contrast to the pragmatic, survival-driven culture of the Harbormen, creating a tense coexistence that would eventually escalate into open confrontation. And it is within this crucible of competing beliefs that the moral, social, and ecological fabric of the island was tested in ways that would define its history for decades, as both groups claimed legitimacy over territory, resources, and interpretation of the fog, which remained a dominant, semi-sentient environmental force shaping every aspect of life on the island. The Harbormen, whose identity had been forged in centuries of intimate observation, adaptation, and hard-earned mastery of the island's ecology, approached the landscape with pragmatism and caution, treating the fog as a threat to be mitigated through careful planning, technological improvisation, and cooperative defense, while the children of Atom interpreted the same phenomenon as a divine manifestation, a sacred gift imbued with meaning and authority, demanding reverence, obedience, and, when necessary, coercion, creating an inherent tension between humanist survival and religious zeal, and these differences were magnified by their overlapping claims to the island's resources, particularly fertile fishing zones, strategic coves, and high ground, which were essential both to subsistence and symbolic legitimacy, so that every interaction became not merely a negotiation of labor or territory, but a reflection of the deeper contest between faith and reason, pragmatism and doctrine, and human autonomy versus divine mandate. And as the population density of Far Harbor increased and settlements became more permanent, the spatial, ecological, and social pressures of the island intensified, making conflict increasingly inevitable and shaping the development of both communities' infrastructure, norms, and strategies. The physical manifestations of this conflict were apparent in both construction and settlement patterns, as the Harbormen fortified their village, establishing lookout towers, walls of scavenged metal, and defensive positions to protect themselves from wildlife and the encroaching zealotry of the children of Atom, while the Atomites consolidated power in the nucleus, raising elevated structures, ceremonial spaces, and defensive barricades that symbolized both religious authority and strategic dominance. And this duality produced a landscape in which movement, trade, and access were constrained by both ideological boundaries and environmental hazards, making navigation of the island a complex negotiation between physical danger and social consequence, where the simple act of traveling from one cove to another carried implicit questions of allegiance, respect, and the potential for violent encounter. And the fog itself amplified these dynamics, as it obscured vision, muffled sound, and altered perception, creating both opportunities for tactical advantage and existential risk, reinforcing the psychological and symbolic significance of territorial control, and reinforcing the power of each group's leaders to dictate not only behavior, but interpretation of the environment, imbuing space with sacred, profane, and contested meaning. The cultural consequences of this ideological divide were profound, as each group developed narratives, rituals, and practices that both reinforced internal cohesion and framed the other as a threat or aberration, for the Harbormen cultivated a pragmatic ethic in which survival, environmental mastery, and communal responsibility were paramount, emphasizing observation, skill, and knowledge of natural and mutated phenomena as markers of authority and social capital, while the children of Atom advanced a doctrinal framework in which devotion to atom and reverence for radioactive manifestations defined status, obedience, and legitimacy. And this fundamental difference in epistemology and value systems created persistent friction in shared spaces, with disputes over fishing rights, sacred sites, and the interpretation of the fog escalating from verbal confrontation to sabotage, skirmishes, and selective acts of violence. And although neither side sought outright extermination in the earliest decades, the cumulative effect of these tensions was a constant undercurrent of threat and mistrust, compelling both populations to remain vigilant, to encode social knowledge in defensive practices, and to establish mechanisms of negotiation, communication, and containment, even as every encounter became a reminder of the fragility of coexistence. The escalation of conflict was further exacerbated by generational shifts, as younger Harbormen and Atomites, born and raised on the island, under the shadow of these competing ideologies, internalized narratives of in-group superiority and out-group threat, producing cycles of prejudice, ritualized hostility, and mutual observation that perpetuated conflict, even in the absence of immediate resource pressure. And as these patterns solidified, leadership structures became more formalized, with the selection of captains, elders, and religious leaders reflecting both competence and ideological conformity, and decision-making processes increasingly incorporated both tactical and moral considerations, as leaders weighed the necessity of maintaining subsistence, mitigating environmental hazards, and preserving social cohesion against the risks of provoking retaliation or alienating potential allies, producing a complex matrix of strategic and ethical calculation, in which survival, belief, and authority were inseparably entwined, and every choice had both practical and symbolic weight, influencing not only daily life but the broader trajectory of the island's civilization. Trade and resource management became arenas of ideological contestation, as both groups required access to overlapping zones of the island for fishing, shelter, and technological salvage, and the contested nature of these areas introduced negotiation, coercion, and occasionally violent enforcement into economic activity, so that every act of commerce carried both practical and political implications, reinforcing the inseparability of faith, survival, and governance, and creating a unique local economy in which the value of a resource was measured not only in calories, material utility, or technological potential, but in its strategic significance and ideological symbolism. For the allocation of fishing rights, access to safe routes through the fog, and control over elevated observation points could determine both physical survival and social legitimacy, and the ability of leaders to enforce or negotiate these distributions became central to their authority, consolidating power in ways that were both visible and subtle, producing a landscape in which material, cognitive, and spiritual dimensions were co-constitutive, and where the ecology, culture, and belief systems of the island were mutually dependent and mutually reinforcing. The presence of the fog further amplified the stakes of this conflict, as it functioned simultaneously as environmental hazard, tactical medium, and spiritual symbol, complicating every attempt at navigation, trade, and territorial control, and lending credence to the children of Atom's interpretation of it as a sacred phenomenon, while reinforcing the Harbormen's insistence on careful observation, measurement, and risk management. And in doing so, the fog became both arbiter and amplifier of ideological tension, enforcing vigilance, shaping behavior, and intensifying the consequences of error, while also providing opportunities for symbolic assertion, strategic advantage, and ritualized confrontation, embedding itself into the moral, social, and ecological fabric of the island in a manner unparalleled anywhere else in the post-war world. And by doing so, it ensured that conflict on Far Harbor was never merely about territory or resources, but about the legitimacy of belief itself, and the capacity of humans to adapt morally, materially, and psychologically to an environment that was at once familiar, threatening, and sacred. Attempts at resolution were intermittent and largely pragmatic, including temporary truces, negotiated boundaries, and limited cooperation in response to immediate crises, such as extreme weather, predator outbreaks, or scarcity of critical resources. Yet these arrangements were always fragile, contingent, and heavily mediated by local knowledge, environmental conditions, and the relative strength of leadership. And while temporary periods of peace allowed for incremental improvements in shelter, fishing, infrastructure, and technological adaptation, the underlying ideological fault lines remained unresolved, producing a perpetual tension in which coexistence was possible only through constant vigilance, careful diplomacy, and adherence to shared conventions of behavior. And in this way, the conflict of faiths became a defining condition of Far Harbor's civilization, shaping social norms, ecological practices, economic interactions, and political authority, and embedding the struggle between pragmatic survivalism and doctrinal devotion into the very identity of the island, ensuring that every generation inherited both the hazards of the environment and the moral complexities of coexistence. In sum, the conflict of faiths on Far Harbor was not a transient episode, but a structural feature of its society, arising from the juxtaposition of pragmatic human survival against apocalyptic religious devotion, intensified by environmental extremity, ecological mutation, and the pervasive presence of the fog. And this struggle defined the island's history, culture, and identity, establishing patterns of behavior, social organization, and ideological engagement that would persist for centuries, setting the stage for subsequent interventions, including the arrival of Dime and Acadia, and ultimately the arrival of the sole survivor, whose choices would intersect with centuries of accumulated tension, belief, and survival strategy, revealing the enduring consequences of an environment in which faith and pragmatism are inseparably entwined, and survival itself is both a physical and moral undertaking, measured against the twin standards of environmental mastery and ideological legitimacy, ensuring that Far Harbor's legacy is a testament to the complexity of human adaptation and the power of belief in shaping both societies and landscapes. The establishment of Acadia on Far Harbor represents one of the most consequential social and technological interventions in the island's history, a deliberate act of sanctuary and governance that arose from the necessity to protect synthetic life from persecution, and in doing so, it transformed the balance of power, ideology, and morality in a landscape already defined by environmental extremity, the fog, and the ideological contest between the Harbormen and the children of Atom. For the synths, artificial creations of the Institute on the mainland, embodied a different conception of life, autonomy, and ethical responsibility, challenging existing human populations to reconsider the definitions of personhood, community, and justice, and the decision to establish Acadia as a hidden refuge on the island reflected both strategic foresight and moral calculus, as Dimar, the architect of the settlement, recognized that Far Harbor's isolation, complex terrain, and dense fog provided both physical protection and a degree of social insulation, allowing the synths to live with a measure of autonomy while minimizing direct conflict with the Harbormen or the Atomites. Yet the presence of this third community introduced an additional layer of complexity to an already contested environment, where every movement, settlement, decision, and ecological interaction could reverberate across political, ideological, and moral domains. And in this context, Acadia's founding was not merely an act of refuge, but a strategic recalibration of the island's social order, introducing a population whose survival depended on discretion, technological sophistication, and diplomacy in equal measure. From the outset, the location and architecture of Acadia reflected both practical necessity and philosophical intent, for the settlement was concealed within the island's northern forests and cliffs designed to be defensible against external threats, including hostile human parties, mutated wildlife, and environmental hazards amplified by the fog, and its structures, built from pre-war remnants, scavenged materials, and carefully engineered additions, emphasized functionality, stealth, and sustainability, creating an infrastructure capable of supporting a small but technologically sophisticated population without imposing upon the fragile resources of the island or directly antagonizing the surrounding communities. And these design choices illustrate the dual priorities of protection and minimal intervention, a recognition that survival required both environmental mastery and careful social calibration, for Acadia's inhabitants could not risk open confrontation with the Harbormen or Children of Atom, whose claims to territory and legitimacy were already deeply entrenched. And any miscalculation could provoke conflict, compromise safety, or undermine the moral principles on which the refuge was founded. Acadia's population, composed primarily of escaped synths and a small contingent of human caretakers and facilitators, developed a society that emphasized ethical governance, communal responsibility, and the integration of technology with survival practices, creating norms and practices that balanced the needs of life, labor, and defense. And these social structures were carefully crafted to mitigate both internal tension and external exposure, establishing routines, hierarchies, and protocols that allowed the community to function efficiently within the ecological and social constraints of the island, while maintaining the moral imperative of protecting sentient beings whose very existence was contested in the wider post-war world. And in doing so, Acadia became both a haven and a laboratory for alternative social organization, exploring questions of autonomy, personhood, and ethical responsibility in a context where conventional human hierarchies and ideological claims were constantly in tension with environmental reality. The Resbug integration of technology within Acadia was both strategic and ethical, reflecting Dimar's careful consideration of the capabilities and vulnerabilities of synth life, as well as the necessity to minimize ecological and social disruption, for the settlement relied on advanced surveillance systems, concealed energy sources, automated defenses, and sophisticated data networks to monitor both environmental hazards and potential intrusions, while simultaneously ensuring that the inhabitants could exercise agency, maintain autonomy, and pursue meaningful social, intellectual, and recreational activities. And the combination of high technology and deliberate restraint illustrates a core principle of the settlement, that survival need not be achieved at the expense of ethical integrity, and that the presence of advanced artificial life forms could coexist with both human and ecological communities, provided the settlement maintained discretion, strategic foresight, and ethical stewardship. The presence of Acadia inevitably introduced tension into the island's existing political and ideological landscape, for both the Harbormen and the Children of Atom had developed entrenched interpretations of territory, resource rights, and legitimacy, and the sudden emergence of a third population with novel capabilities, alternative forms of authority, and an ethical mandate to protect a previously marginalized class of sentient beings challenged existing norms, forcing negotiation, cautious observation, and in some cases, defensive posturing. And while the initial interactions were mediated by discretion and Dimmer's strategic diplomacy, the presence of Acadia created a dynamic equilibrium in which multiple authorities, ethical frameworks, and technological capacities coexisted in a fragile balance, reinforcing the island's status as a complex ecosystem, not only of flora, fauna, and environment, but of ideology, morality, and technological agency, where survival, legitimacy, and ethical responsibility were inseparable, and where the introduction of synthetic life forced all human populations to reconsider the boundaries of their moral and social universe. Acadia's influence extended beyond its immediate population, as the settlement became a node of intelligence, negotiation, and strategic mediation on the island, facilitating communication, resource allocation, and conflict management, while also providing sanctuary for individuals, families, and refugees who might otherwise have been vulnerable to both environmental hazards and human or ideological predation. And in doing so, the settlement contributed to the stabilization of certain areas of the island, even as it complicated interactions in contested zones, for its technological capabilities, organizational discipline, and ethical orientation, allowed it to intervene subtly in disputes, provide logistical support, and mediate conflicts, establishing itself as a critical third axis of authority in an otherwise binary landscape of Harbormen versus Atomites, and embedding within the social and political ecology of Far Harbor a principle of negotiation, moral calculation, and technological stewardship that had no precedent in the island's prior history. At the same time, the presence of Acadia underscored the broader moral and philosophical questions inherent in the post-war world, particularly those regarding the rights of artificial life, the obligations of human societies to protect or integrate sentient creations, and the ethical limits of survival in environments shaped by scarcity, mutation, and environmental hazard. And these questions were not abstract. For every settlement decision, every patrol, every negotiation with the Harbormen or Children of Atom carried immediate consequences for both physical survival and moral legitimacy, embedding ethical reasoning into the practicalities of daily life and creating a culture in which moral foresight, technical skill, and ecological understanding were inseparable, forming the foundation for long-term social stability, ethical accountability, and strategic resilience, and ensuring that the challenges faced by Acadia's inhabitants were simultaneously existential, technological, and philosophical, demanding continuous adaptation, learning, and negotiation. The establishment of Acadia also reshaped the broader environmental and social equilibrium of Far Harbor, as the settlement's practices of resource management, defensive positioning, and ecological intervention influenced patterns of migration, predator-prey interactions, and resource availability, altering the lived experience of both human populations and mutated wildlife, and demonstrating that technology, ethical foresight, and population management could exert measurable influence on ecological systems, even in a landscape as extreme and hazardous as Far Harbor, where the fog, mutated species, and limited resources dictated the parameters of survival, and where human and artificial populations alike were compelled to adapt continuously in response to environmental, social, and ideological pressures, producing a dynamic equilibrium that was as much the product of planning, foresight, and diplomacy as it was of environmental forces, and in which the actions of a single settlement could reverberate across the island for decades, influencing both the material and moral dimensions of Far Harbor life. In conclusion, Acadia's arrival and establishment on Far Harbor was not merely a matter of shelter or refuge, but a transformative intervention that introduced new dimensions of technology, ethics, and governance into a landscape already defined by environmental extremity, ideological contestation, and social complexity. And in doing so, it reshaped the moral, strategic, and ecological calculus of survival, creating a society in which the protection of sentient life, the exercise of technological capability, and the maintenance of ethical principles were inseparable from the practical imperatives of daily life, and where the interplay between human, synthetic, and environmental forces created a dynamic, continuously negotiated equilibrium that would define the island's history, identity, and moral character for generations to come, ensuring that Far Harbor was not only a crucible of survival, but also a locus for questions of personhood, authority, and ethical responsibility, the consequences of which would extend far beyond the boundaries of its fog-shrouded shores. DMA, the enigmatic architect of Acadia, stands as one of the most consequential yet morally ambiguous figures in the history of Far Harbor, a synthetic being whose origins are entwined with the technological, political, and ethical landscapes of the Commonwealth, whose decisions on the island have shaped the delicate equilibrium between the Harbormen, the children of Atom, and the synthetic refugees under his care, and whose history is inseparable from the broader narrative of the Institute, the shadowy scientific and authoritarian organization responsible for creating synths and manipulating human populations across the wasteland. Fadima was not merely a creation of the Institute, but an agent of improvisation, moral experimentation, and autonomous action, having been deployed initially as a field operative with technical, administrative, and reconnaissance capabilities that allowed him to navigate complex social and logistical environments. And it is this combination of programmed loyalty, adaptive intelligence, and personal initiative that enabled him to forge an independent identity over decades, gradually transforming from a tool of centralized power into a self-directed actor, capable of making decisions that would reverberate far beyond the immediate purview of his creators, a transformation that culminated in the founding of Acadia as a sanctuary for synths seeking freedom, safety, and moral legitimacy in a world often unwilling to acknowledge their personhood, and it is through this lens that his secret history must be examined. For the choices he made, the compromises he enacted and the interventions he orchestrated are inseparable from the fragile balance that defines Far Harbor. Born into the synthetic lineage of the Institute, Dimmer's early operational history is defined by a combination of obedience, skill, and the capacity for long-term planning, having been tasked with infiltration, intelligence gathering, and logistical coordination across hostile territories, including the Commonwealth, where his presence was often undetected due to the Institute's capacity for remote monitoring and the synthetic's ability to blend seamlessly into human society. And it was in these formative missions that Dime developed the tools of discretion, negotiation, and strategic foresight, observing human behavior across multiple settlements, understanding the emergent social hierarchies, and recording the nuances of human morality, ambition, and fear. And in doing so, he cultivated not only a technical expertise, but an ethical framework, one that would allow him to act in ways that diverged from Institute directives when circumstances demanded. For Dime quickly recognized that absolute adherence to the Institute's objectives often conflicted with the practicalities of survival, human welfare, and the long-term interests of the synths under his nominal protection. And these early experiences instilled a capacity for moral pragmatism, a willingness to manipulate, compromise, or intervene behind the scenes to preserve life, maintain stability, or achieve outcomes that were ethically justifiable within the context of his understanding, even when such actions violated explicit orders. Dimmer's connection to the Institute is marked by both loyalty and subtle subversion, a duality that defines his presence on Far Harbor. For while he remains a product of pre-war scientific ambition, a creation designed for control and surveillance, he possesses the capacity for independent judgment, ethical reasoning, and long-term planning that exceeds the parameters of his original programming, and it is this duality that allows him to operate simultaneously as a mediator, strategist, and moral actor on the island, balancing the competing claims of human and synthetic life, environmental hazard, and ideological conflict. And the consequences of these decisions are profound. For every intervention by Dime, whether it is facilitating the creation of Acadia, managing resources, maintaining diplomatic relations, or deploying subtle psychological strategies, alters the power dynamics of the island, reinforcing stability in some areas while introducing uncertainty in others, demonstrating that his moral calculus is inseparable from both practical governance and philosophical reflection, and that the survival of Acadia, as well as the fragile coexistence between atom, Harbormen, and synthetic populations, is a direct product of his judgment, discretion, and willingness to assume responsibility for outcomes that no single human or organizational authority could oversee or manage effectively. One of the central tensions in Dimmer's history lies in his manipulation of human and synthetic populations in ways that are ethically fraught but strategically necessary, for, in order to protect Acadia and maintain the balance of power, he has on multiple occasions concealed truths, withheld information, and orchestrated events, whose immediate consequences are morally ambiguous, and these actions reflect a utilitarian approach to governance in which the preservation of life and long-term stability outweighs adherence to conventional standards of honesty or fairness, and this moral pragmatism, while effective in maintaining the island's equilibrium, casts a shadow over his legacy, raising questions about autonomy, consent, and the ethical limits of intervention. For the very populations he protects are often unaware of the choices, manipulations, or compromises that have shaped their present circumstances, and in this sense, Dimay functions as both caretaker and architect of Far Harbor's social and political reality, a figure whose influence is pervasive, yet largely invisible, whose decisions are both protective and coercive, and whose moral authority is grounded in competence, foresight, and ethical calculation, rather than formal position or traditional leadership. Dime's past is further complicated by his extensive experience with the Commonwealth, where his missions exposed him to the ethical compromises of the Institute, the consequences of unchecked technological power, and the fragility of human societies in the post-apocalyptic context. For he observed firsthand the manipulation, displacement, and often violent control imposed by the Institute on settlements, human communities, and synthetic beings, and these observations informed his subsequent choices on Far Harbor, instilling a cautious approach to both intervention and diplomacy, a recognition that rigid adherence to ideology or authority often produces catastrophic outcomes, and a commitment to balancing freedom, protection, and oversight in ways that maximize survival and moral legitimacy. And it is precisely this synthesis of experience, observation, and calculated judgment that allows Dime to navigate the complex moral terrain of Far Harbor, where every decision intersects with environmental risk, ideological pressure, and questions of sentience, agency, and ethical responsibility. The founding of Acadia represents the culmination of Dime's secret history, a deliberate and carefully orchestrated act that integrates his ethical reasoning, strategic foresight, and understanding of human and synthetic behavior. For the settlement is designed to protect synths from persecution, provide a neutral space for negotiation, and maintain the ecological and social balance of Far Harbor, and its construction reflects Dime's dual priorities: safeguarding life while minimizing conflict, both ecological and human, and preserving the moral integrity of the community under his stewardship, even when this requires morally ambiguous interventions, secrecy, or deception, and the successful operation of Acadia depends on his continuous attention, his deployment of technological resources, and his ability to anticipate the consequences of both human ambition and environmental hazard, creating a dynamic equilibrium that is fragile yet resilient, contingent upon discretion, foresight, and adaptive ethical reasoning. And in this way, Dime's secret history is inseparable from the ongoing survival, social order, and moral coherence of the island, for his presence mediates conflict, shapes strategy, and enables a form of coexistence that might otherwise have been impossible. Ultimately, Dime embodies the tension between autonomy and programming, morality and pragmatism, protection and manipulation, serving as a bridge between synthetic intelligence, human communities, and the ecological realities of Far Harbor. And his actions reveal the complexities inherent in governing a post-apocalyptic society, where survival, ethical responsibility, and strategic calculation are intertwined, and where the long-term fate of communities, populations, and ideologies is inseparable from the judgment and discretion of a single actor capable of perceiving both immediate risk and long-term consequence. And it is through the lens of Dime's secret history that one can understand not only the operation of Acadia and the balance of Far Harbor, but also the broader ethical questions of Fallout's world, the rights of sentient creations, the moral obligations of power, and the nuanced calculus required to preserve life and stability in the shadow of devastation, mutation, and ideological conflict. For Dima's choices define both the present and future of the island, illustrating the inseparable interplay of ethics, technology, and survival in a landscape as morally and environmentally complex as Far Harbor. The Harbormen of Far Harbor represent the enduring human response to environmental extremity, isolation, and the persistent threat of both natural and ideological hazards. A society whose customs, superstitions, and material practices are deeply intertwined with the island's geography, the omnipresent fog, and the constant pressure of survival, and whose identity has been forged over generations through careful observation of the land, mastery of maritime resources, and the necessity of communal cooperation in a world that offers no second chances. For unlike other post-war settlements that have depended primarily on pre-war infrastructure or external support, the Harbormen have relied on an intimate, inherited knowledge of the local ecology, tidal rhythms, and mutated species, a form of practical intelligence that encompasses both technical skill and experiential wisdom, and which has allowed them to build resilient structures, craft effective weapons, and develop an adaptive culture capable of weathering both environmental disaster and ideological conflict. Yet their ingenuity is inseparable from a framework of belief, ritual, and superstition, in which the unpredictable fog, the behavior of mutated creatures, and the presence of the children of Atom are understood not merely as hazards, but as elements of a moral and cosmological order that governs action, risk, and responsibility. And in this way, the Harbormen's way is a synthesis of pragmatic skill, ethical reasoning, and environmental literacy, embodied in the daily practices, social hierarchies, and cultural narratives that sustain life on the island. Central to Harbormen society is the organization of labor and the transmission of knowledge. For survival in Far Harbor demands collective effort and intergenerational continuity, and these priorities manifest in both visible and subtle ways, from the construction and maintenance of fishing vessels to the careful management of shelters, weapons, and food stores, and from the oral transmission of navigation techniques and environmental observation to the ritualized practices that encode practical knowledge into cultural memory, ensuring that every generation learns the intricate patterns of tide, wind, and predator behavior that govern life on the coast and in the forests. And in doing so, the Harbormen transform experience into a social currency, in which competence, observation, and wisdom establish authority, reputation, and influence, while failure or miscalculation carries immediate and often fatal consequences, reinforcing a culture in which expertise and prudence are not merely valued, but essential for collective survival, and where every individual, from young apprentices to seasoned elders, participates in the ongoing negotiation between human capacity and environmental extremity. The Harbormen's material culture reflects their adaptation to the island's unique challenges, emphasizing functionality, repair, and ingenuity. For their boats are handcrafted from salvaged wood and reinforced with scavenged metal, designed to navigate both shallow coves and turbulent waters, while their shelters are constructed to resist the corrosive influence of the fog and to provide protection from mutated predators, yet remain repairable and adaptable to changing environmental conditions, and weapons, both melee and ranged, are forged with improvisation in mind, combining pre-war technology with local materials to produce tools capable of defending both life and property against the unpredictable hazards of the island. And this material culture is inseparable from the island's ecology, as each innovation reflects careful observation of flora, fauna, weather patterns, and the movement of the fog, producing a body of practical knowledge that is codified both in craft and in oral teaching, and which forms the backbone of the Harbormen's enduring resilience. Ritual, superstition, and social convention also play a central role in structuring life among the Harbormen, for the persistent threat of the fog, mutated wildlife, and ideological conflict has produced a cultural framework in which observance of taboos, respect for natural and supernatural phenomena, and adherence to practical routines are both moral and pragmatic imperatives. And in this context, customs surrounding navigation, hunting, fishing, and shelter construction acquire symbolic and ethical significance, creating a cultural system in which the environment is both teacher and arbiter, and in which compliance with collective wisdom ensures both survival and social cohesion. And this interplay of superstition and skill reinforces social norms, hierarchical authority, and communal responsibility, embedding a sense of moral and environmental literacy that guides both daily life and long-term decision-making, producing a culture in which every action carries consequence and every individual participates in a network of interdependent knowledge, accountability, and mutual protection. The Harbormen's maritime expertise is a defining feature of their identity, for the ocean and coastal environment are central to both subsistence and social organization, providing fish, shellfish, and trade routes while shaping patterns of settlement, defense, and ritual, and knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal behavior of marine species is transmitted orally and reinforced through repeated practice, observation, and apprenticeship, creating a form of expertise that is both highly localized and indispensable, yet constantly tested by the unpredictable movement of the fog, which can obscure landmarks, alter predator behavior, and challenge navigation, requiring adaptive strategies, constant vigilance, and a capacity for improvisation that is deeply embedded in Harbormen culture and which forms the foundation of their distinctive worldview, in which mastery of the environment is inseparable from moral responsibility, social cohesion, and survival. The social and political organization of the Harbormen reflects these priorities, balancing communal responsibility with individual competence. For leadership is generally conferred on those who demonstrate skill, experience, and the capacity for sound judgment, rather than by hereditary right or formalized authority, producing a society in which respect is earned through action, observation, and contribution, and where decision-making is guided by both practical necessity and ethical reflection, and in which collective welfare is inseparable from environmental stewardship, technological skill, and strategic foresight, and the integration of these elements ensures that the community can respond effectively to both immediate threats, such as predator attacks, fog incursions, or ideological confrontation, and longer-term challenges, such as resource scarcity, environmental change, and the moral and social consequences of maintaining boundaries against competing populations. The Harbormen's interaction with the children of Atom, and later with Acadia, demonstrates the adaptive flexibility of their culture, for while deeply conservative in their attachment to tradition, observation, and environmental mastery, they are capable of negotiation, alliance, and strategic compromise when circumstances demand, balancing survival against ideological purity, pragmatism against moral principle, and autonomy against collective security. And these interactions produce a dynamic social ecosystem in which diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and ethical reasoning are as vital as maritime skill or craftsmanship, reflecting the integration of survival, culture, and morality into a coherent system of practice, belief, and social organization, and ensuring that the Harbormen remain both resilient and adaptive, able to maintain their identity and cohesion despite environmental extremity and ideological encroachment. In sum, the Harbormen's way is a synthesis of survival skill, ethical reflection, material ingenuity, and ecological literacy, a cultural system forged in response to the extremities of Far Harbor, the omnipresence of the fog, the threat of mutation, and the ideological pressures imposed by the children of Atom, and sustained through careful observation, apprenticeship, ritual, and intergenerational transmission of knowledge, producing a society in which competence, prudence, and moral awareness are inseparable, and where the survival of the community depends upon the continuous interplay of environmental mastery, technological improvisation, and ethical reasoning, ensuring that the Harbormen endure not merely as survivors, but as a culture defined by resilience, adaptability, and the subtle but persistent negotiation of life, hazard, and human purpose in one of the most extreme and morally complex regions of the post-war world. And in this enduring framework, the Harbormen are both witnesses to and participants in the ongoing struggle to balance human ambition, ideological pressure, and environmental reality on the fog-shrouded shores of Far Harbor. The nucleus, the central settlement and spiritual heart of the children of Atom on Far Harbor, represents the physical and ideological manifestation of a faith that interprets radiation not as a destructive force, but as a sacred gift, a transformative energy that defines both morality and existence, and within its fortified walls, the children's beliefs are codified, performed, and enforced, producing a society in which every action, structure, and ritual reinforces the doctrinal principle that Atom is divine and that the fog is a tangible sign of his presence. For the settlement is constructed with both practical and symbolic considerations in mind, elevated above the lowlands, fortified with scavenged metal, reinforced concrete, and repurposed pre-war structures, creating a physical manifestation of sacred space that is at once defensible, visible, and imbued with religious meaning, and the architecture itself communicates hierarchy, power, and ritual significance, with the most sacred chambers, offerings, and ceremonial spaces positioned at the center, surrounded by the dwellings of adherents, workspaces, and observation posts, forming a concentric order that mirrors the theological hierarchy of the cult, reinforcing both obedience and cohesion while delineating zones of sacred and profane activity. And it is within this spatial organization that the children of Atom interpret their environment, instruct new initiates, and exert authority over both the material and spiritual life of the island. Life within the nucleus is structured around ritual observance, labor, and the management of exposure to radiation, reflecting a theology in which the physical and spiritual are inseparable, and where health, status, and power are mediated through proximity to and interaction with radioactive materials, mutated flora, and the omnipresent fog, which is interpreted as both protective and purifying, capable of rewarding faithfulness and punishing negligence. For the children regard illness, mutation, and exposure as tests of devotion, as opportunities for spiritual growth, and as tangible expressions of Atom's will, creating a system in which moral and ecological behavior are inseparably linked, and in which the conduct of every individual contributes to the collective moral and spiritual health of the settlement, reinforcing both hierarchical authority and communal cohesion, and ensuring that adherence to doctrine is not merely theoretical, but enacted through embodied practice, labor, and environmental engagement, so that each member's survival, comfort, and status are contingent upon their fidelity to the cult's interpretation of the divine glow. Leadership within the nucleus is both spiritual and pragmatic, with high-ranking clerics and overseers responsible for interpreting Atom's will, managing resources, and enforcing social conformity, and this dual role reflects the cult's integration of religious and material authority, as spiritual guidance is inseparable from the management of labor, defense, and ritual observance, and adherence to leadership is enforced through both social and theological mechanisms, including ritualized sanctions, communal observation, and doctrinal instruction, producing a disciplined and cohesive society in which deviation from prescribed behavior is regarded not merely as social misstep, but as spiritual transgression, with consequences that extend to the individual, the collective, and the perceived favor of Atom. And this system of moral and social governance ensures that the nucleus operates efficiently while maintaining the ideological coherence and devotional intensity that define the children's culture, even in the face of environmental hazards, external threats, and internal dissent. Ritual life in the nucleus is centered on the interaction with radiation and the fog, which the children interpret as sacred phenomena, capable of providing insight, guidance, and spiritual power. And these rituals range from offerings of irradiated objects to communal gatherings in which the faithful enact symbolic gestures of devotion, purification, and submission, reinforcing both collective identity and the hierarchical structure of the cult, and ensuring that each individual's participation is both an affirmation of faith and a reinforcement of communal cohesion. For the children of Atom view the act of ritual as a means of aligning physical, moral, and spiritual energies with the divine will, creating an environment in which the material properties of radiation, mutation, and the fog are inseparable from ethical and theological meaning, and in which the practice of daily life, including labor, observation, and resource management, is both a form of worship and a method of maintaining social and environmental order, producing a complex interplay of belief, material practice, and ecological adaptation that defines the identity of the nucleus and its inhabitants. The children of Atom also leverage the nucleus as a center of power and defense, for its elevated position, fortified walls, and observation posts allow them to monitor both the environment and neighboring settlements, including the Harbormen and, later, Acadia, and to enforce territorial claims over key fishing zones, sacred areas, and strategic passages, creating a dual function in which religious observance and tactical advantage are mutually reinforcing, and in which control over the sacred spaces of the nucleus is inseparable from the management of resources, defense, and social hierarchy. And this integration of ideology and strategy ensures that the cult remains resilient, capable of defending itself, while maintaining the intensity of spiritual practice and doctrinal authority, and that every individual within the settlement is both spiritually and materially invested in the collective survival and legitimacy of the group, producing a society in which belief and action are inseparable, and where the fog, radiation, and human agency converge to define the boundaries of power, authority, and sacred significance. The cult's interpretation of radiation as both sacrament and weapon further amplifies the stakes of life within and around the nucleus. For the glow is regarded not merely as a source of spiritual insight, but as a tangible force capable of harming or rewarding, guiding or punishing, and shaping both internal hierarchy and external relations. And in this context, the children's willingness to manipulate irradiated materials, enforce exposure-based rituals, and leverage their understanding of radioactive phenomena for strategic advantage underscores the integration of faith, knowledge, and tactical awareness that characterizes life in the settlement, producing a social and material ecosystem in which spiritual authority, technical skill, and environmental literacy are mutually dependent, and where the successful exercise of power and devotion requires mastery of both doctrinal principles and the practical realities of the island, ensuring that the nucleus functions as both a center of faith and a locus of strategic influence. The presence of the nucleus, its rituals, and its ideological authority also shape the surrounding environment and social landscape. As the children's activities influence patterns of movement, resource allocation, and territorial access, forcing neighboring populations, particularly the Harbormen, to adapt to both environmental hazards and ideological constraints. And in doing so, the nucleus becomes a focal point not only of religious devotion, but of ecological and social control, establishing boundaries, patterns of observation, and zones of influence that extend beyond its walls and into the forests, coves, and fishing grounds of Far Harbor. And this extension of power ensures that the cult's beliefs are materially and socially consequential, producing a dynamic equilibrium in which survival, ideology, and environmental mastery are inseparably intertwined, and where the movement, behavior, and morality of surrounding populations are subtly guided by the presence and authority of the nucleus, reinforcing both its symbolic and practical significance. Finally, the nucleus exemplifies the ways in which ideology, material practice, and environmental reality intersect in the children of Atom, demonstrating that belief in Atom is not merely a spiritual proposition, but a framework for organizing life, labor, defense, and ecological engagement, and that the survival of both the cult and the island's population is inseparable from the integration of ritual, hierarchy, and environmental adaptation. For the fog, the glow, and the island's hazards are both theological signifiers and practical constraints. And it is only through disciplined adherence to doctrine, mastery of local conditions, and strategic observation that the children maintain both cohesion and influence, producing a settlement that is simultaneously sacred, fortified, and socially complex, and that embodies the convergence of faith, survival, and authority in one of the most ideologically and environmentally extreme locations in the post-war world, ensuring that the nucleus remains both the spiritual and practical heart of the children of Atom and a defining locus of power, ritual, and moral significance on Far Harbor. The introduction of fog condensers to Far Harbor represents a pivotal technological intervention in the ongoing struggle to manage the island's defining environmental phenomenon. The omnipresent and corrosive fog, whose persistent presence has shaped the ecology, social structures, and ideological conflicts of the region, and whose control or mitigation became a central concern for every community seeking to survive within its mist-shrouded boundaries, For the fog is not merely a meteorological curiosity, but a radioactive, semi-sentient force that interacts with local flora, fauna, and human settlements in unpredictable ways, creating both existential hazard and symbolic significance. And the invention and deployment of condensers by humans on the island, utilizing principles of electrostatic precipitation, atmospheric manipulation, and energy redirection, represents a material attempt to impose order on a phenomenon that is otherwise beyond direct human control. And in doing so, these devices became both practical instruments and strategic levers, influencing patterns of settlement, resource access, and ideological legitimacy, as control over the fog could determine survival, dictate the movement of populations, and even shape the moral and spiritual claims of the children of Atom, whose interpretation of the fog as divine intersected with the Harbormen's pragmatic approach to environmental mastery, creating a landscape in which technology, ideology, and survival are inseparably entwined. The design and operation of the condensers, pioneered initially by Faraday and later adapted by Dimmer and local Harbormen engineers, reflect a combination of pre-war knowledge, post-war ingenuity, and an acute understanding of the island's unique atmospheric conditions. For the fog exhibits unusual density, chemical composition, and radioactivity, properties that require both careful calibration and continuous observation, and the condensers themselves are complex devices integrating mechanical, electrical, and energy dispersal components to draw excess moisture and radioactive particulates from the air, concentrating and neutralizing them in controlled containment zones. And while their capacity to entirely eliminate the fog is limited, they produce localized zones of reduced density, visibility, and radiation, allowing safer navigation, resource extraction, and habitation, and creating tactical advantages for those capable of controlling or accessing the devices, thus establishing a technological hierarchy that complements existing ideological and social hierarchies and reshapes the balance of power on the island. The condenser's influence extends beyond immediate environmental effects, as their presence shapes both strategic planning and political negotiation, for control over operational condensers becomes a critical factor in the interactions between Harbormen, children of Atom, and the synth inhabitants of Acadia, and the ability to deploy, maintain, or sabotage these devices directly impacts fishing zones, travel routes, and territorial claims, producing a dynamic in which technological mastery is inseparable from survival and social authority, and where the ethical, tactical, and practical considerations of operation intersect, requiring operators to navigate complex moral terrain, balancing communal safety, personal interest, and the potential for conflict escalation. And in this context, condensers are simultaneously instruments of survival, tools of negotiation, and symbols of technological and intellectual authority, reflecting the intricate interplay between material innovation, environmental hazard, and social power on Far Harbor. The condensers also illustrate the integration of human ingenuity and adaptive problem-solving within a landscape of extreme ecological constraint. For the Harbormen, who possess intimate knowledge of tidal patterns, wind behavior, and the density variations of the fog, provide critical observational data that informs condenser placement, calibration, and maintenance, while Dimmer contributes technical expertise, strategic oversight, and ethical guidance to ensure that their operation does not inadvertently harm synth populations, disturb fragile ecosystems, or provoke ideological confrontation with the children of Atom, and this collaboration exemplifies a broader principle of adaptive governance, in which environmental knowledge, technological skill, and ethical foresight converge, producing an emergent form of social ecological management that is capable of negotiating the island's persistent hazards while simultaneously reinforcing social cohesion, moral responsibility, and strategic advantage. The balance of power achieved through condenser technology is inherently fragile, for the fog is neither fully understood nor entirely controllable, and fluctuations in atmospheric conditions, mechanical failures, or sabotage can quickly disrupt local zones of safety, forcing populations to revert to traditional survival strategies and to reassert vigilance over both human and environmental threats. And the temporary nature of technological mastery reinforces the dependency of all communities on knowledge, observation, and adaptability, highlighting the limitations of even the most sophisticated devices in a post-apocalyptic environment, and underscoring the interplay between human initiative, environmental forces, and the ethical responsibilities of those who wield power. For the consequences of failure are immediate, tangible, and often lethal, whether through exposure to radiation, loss of access to critical resources, or escalation of conflict. The condensers also interact with the ideological frameworks of the island's populations, as the children of Atom interpret attempts to control the fog as either sacrilege or a test of devotion, and Harbormen see them as tools of survival that complement empirical knowledge, while synths in Acadia navigate both perspectives with strategic discretion, producing a moral and ideological calculus in which technological action carries spiritual, social, and existential weight, and where operators of the condensers are constantly negotiating between the practical imperatives of environmental management and the complex social terrain of faith, authority, and survival, ensuring that every decision, from turning the device on or off to its placement and maintenance, is laden with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate reduction of atmospheric density, and that intertwine with questions of legitimacy, moral responsibility, and ecological stewardship. The historical and strategic significance of the condensers is further amplified by the interventions of Faraday, whose engineering expertise, understanding of atmospheric physics, and capacity for improvisation were instrumental in designing devices capable of operating within the challenging conditions of Far Harbor, and whose work laid the foundation for subsequent refinements by DMA and local operators, producing an integrated system of environmental management that reflects both continuity and adaptation across decades of technological innovation, social negotiation, and environmental observation, and ensuring that control of the fog is not a static achievement, but a continuous process of monitoring, adjustment, and intervention, requiring both skill and foresight, and producing a material metaphor for the ongoing struggle to impose order on a landscape defined by extreme hazard, ideological contestation, and ecological complexity. Ultimately, the condensers demonstrate the inseparability of technology, ideology, and survival on Far Harbor, for their operation is simultaneously a practical response to environmental hazard, a tool of social and political negotiation, and a symbolic assertion of human agency in the face of forces that are simultaneously natural, radioactive, and semi-divine in the perception of the children of Atom, and in this interplay, they embody the broader dynamics of the island, in which knowledge, skill, and moral judgment define both the capacity to survive and the legitimacy of authority. and where the balance of power is not dictated solely by force, faith, or environmental mastery, but by the capacity to integrate these elements through observation, foresight, and the careful application of technological innovation, ensuring that control of the fog, partial, fragile, and contingent, shapes the physical, social, and moral geography of Far Harbor and remains a decisive factor in the ongoing negotiation between survival, ideology, and human and synthetic agency on the fog-shrouded island. Beneath the fog-laden waters surrounding Far Harbor lies a hidden and largely unexplored domain, a submerged landscape that preserves the remnants of pre-war industry, military research, and human ambition, and whose ruins offer both practical resources and enigmatic evidence of the island's historical entanglement with national defense, technological experimentation, and scientific inquiry. For the coastline and underwater zones conceal a variety of wrecked ships, sunken submarines, and partially flooded bunkers that speak to the island's strategic significance prior to the Great War, and to the intensity of human activity in the region despite its isolation. And while some of these structures were intended for logistical or commercial purposes, others served as instruments of military research, including underwater observation, ordnance testing, and chemical and radiological experiments, and the submerged remnants preserve both physical artifacts and the ethical ambiguities of human experimentation, allowing those who investigate to reconstruct elements of a forgotten technological and moral landscape, where survival, secrecy, and the pursuit of knowledge intersected with strategic imperatives and environmental hazard, and where every discovery raises questions about the continuity of pre-war practices in the post-war world and the lingering consequences for both human and ecological populations on the island. Among the most striking underwater secrets are the sunken vessels that dot the shallow bays and coves, remnants of a maritime economy that once linked Far Harbor to the mainland and broader Atlantic trade networks, and which now serve as both shelters for mutated aquatic species and repositories of pre-war technology and material culture. For fishing vessels, barges, and even small cargo ships, once vital to the livelihoods of local fishermen, now rest at the bottom of coves, in various states of decay, encrusted with algae, corroded by prolonged exposure to salt water, and partially embedded in sediment. And yet these wrecks offer both resources and insight, providing salvageable metal, mechanical components, and navigational instruments, while simultaneously preserving evidence of shipbuilding techniques, maritime culture, and the economic imperatives that once drove the region, creating a layered historical record in which the material traces of commerce, labor, and technological capacity intersect with environmental transformation, mutation, and the unpredictable consequences of radioactive contamination that now define the underwater landscape. Far more enigmatic are the submerged bunkers and research facilities, many of which were constructed by the U.S., Navy, and related defense agencies prior to the war, for these structures were designed to support the island's strategic role in national defense, including monitoring of submarine routes, experimentation with sonar and underwater communication, and investigation of nuclear and chemical phenomena. And though their exact purpose has been obscured by decades of decay, flooding, and incomplete records, their presence suggests that Far Harbor was considered a site of particular operational value, chosen for its relative isolation, access to the Atlantic, and proximity to strategic shipping lanes, and the remnants of these facilities, including partially intact control rooms, corroded instrumentation, and storage vaults, offer both practical salvage and tantalizing clues to the nature of pre-war military and scientific ambition, highlighting the interplay between human ingenuity, secrecy, and the latent environmental hazards that persist in the post-war landscape, where radioactive contamination, structural instability, and mutated aquatic life present constant challenges to those who seek to explore these hidden spaces. The wrecked submarines that rest beneath the surface are particularly notable, for they combine technological sophistication with symbolic resonance, representing both the apex of pre-war engineering and the vulnerability of human enterprise to environmental and historical contingency. For while these vessels were once cutting-edge instruments of naval power, designed to traverse the Atlantic undetected and deliver strategic payloads, they now lie abandoned, partially flooded, and integrated into the ecological systems of the island, providing shelter to mutated aquatic species, algae, and other forms of marine life, and forming microhabitats that contrast sharply with their intended purpose. And in this transformation, they illustrate the broader themes of post-war decay, adaptation, and the unpredictable consequences of technological hubris, serving simultaneously as reminders of human ambition and as components of a new, radiation-infused ecological order in which survival, mutation, and environmental adaptation have supplanted the original imperatives of design, strategy, and military control. The submerged ruins are further complicated by the presence of lingering radiation, chemical residue, and environmental instability. For many pre-war experiments, storage facilities and ordnance depots were left active or partially deactivated prior to the war, allowing radioactive materials and chemical byproducts to leach into the surrounding waters, altering the chemistry of the bays and coves, mutating aquatic species, and creating zones of hazard that are both tangible and morally charged. And this contamination illustrates the long-term consequences of human activity, embedding ethical, technological, and environmental considerations within the very fabric of the underwater landscape, such that exploration, salvage, or habitation of these spaces requires not only physical skill and technological capability, but ethical and strategic foresight. For the act of intrusion into these spaces can produce immediate harm, long-term ecological disruption, and complex moral implications, reinforcing the post-war maxim that survival is inseparable from knowledge, caution, and reflection on past human behavior. The interaction between these submerged spaces and the island's contemporary inhabitants is complex and mediated by both practical and ideological considerations. For the Harbormen, exploit shallow wrecks for salvage and occasional shelter, applying inherited maritime knowledge to extract material resources without disturbing the structural integrity of the environment, while the children of Atom view certain radiologically contaminated sites as sacred, interpreting exposure as both trial and blessing, and synths from Acadia navigate these zones with strategic discretion, balancing the pursuit of knowledge, resource acquisition, and ethical responsibility, and this interplay creates a dynamic social and moral landscape in which underwater exploration is both materially and ideologically consequential, producing negotiation, observation, and intervention as necessary elements of interaction, and ensuring that the submerged remains of pre-war activity continue to influence social, ecological, and technological patterns on the island. Finally, The secrets beneath the sea function as both historical record and cautionary tale, preserving evidence of pre-war technological ambition, military strategy, and environmental manipulation, while simultaneously demonstrating the fragility of human systems in the face of environmental transformation, radioactive mutation, and ideological contestation. For the ruined vessels, bunkers, and experimental installations serve as reminders that human ingenuity, while formidable, is neither infallible nor permanent, and that the pursuit of power, knowledge, and control carries consequences that persist across generations, reshaping ecological, social, and moral landscapes in ways that are often unforeseen and that the contemporary populations of Far Harbor must navigate, mitigate, or reinterpret to survive, understand, and coexist within their fog-shrouded, irradiated world, making the underwater domain both a repository of memory and a living component of the ongoing struggle between human ambition, environmental extremity, and moral responsibility, a submerged testament to the intersection of history, technology, and survival on one of the most unique and challenging islands in the Fallout universe. Kasumi Nakano's story emerges as one of the most personal and human narratives within the broader chaos and ideological conflict of Far Harbor, her journey reflecting the collision of individual memory, identity, and the post-war ethical dilemmas of synthetic creation. For she is a synth who fled from the Institute in the Commonwealth, seeking autonomy and the truth of her existence in a world that is simultaneously hostile, morally complex, and indifferent to the distinctions between human and artificial life. And her arrival on the island is not merely a narrative device, but a lens through which the implications of identity, memory, and personal agency can be explored, illuminating the moral, emotional, and practical consequences of the Institute's technological ambitions, the choices of intermediaries, such as Dime, and the intersection of individual will with the larger forces of survival, ideology, and environmental extremity that define Far Harbor. And in this context, Kasumi's struggle is emblematic of the larger questions that permeate the island: what it means to be sentient, to possess autonomy, and to define the boundaries of selfhood in a landscape where the past, technology, and faith converge with the urgent demands of survival. Kasumi's initial flight from the Commonwealth is rooted in a series of traumatic experiences, both personal and systemic, arising from the Institute's treatment of synths as tools rather than beings, and from the layered surveillance, manipulation, and ethical violations that accompanied her creation and deployment. And these experiences frame her perspective upon arrival in Far Harbor, where the island's extreme conditions, the omnipresent fog, and the tensions between Harbormen, Children of Atom, and Acadia provide both sanctuary and challenge, forcing her to navigate a space in which trust, identity, and agency are constantly tested, and where the moral frameworks of multiple communities intersect, compelling her to negotiate not only survival, but the preservation of her selfhood, a negotiation that is both internal and external, involving the reconciliation of implanted memories, the pursuit of truth regarding her origins, and the assertion of her autonomy against the ethical, political, and environmental pressures that surround her. Kasumi's interactions with the sole survivor, the player character, are central to the exploration of identity and lost selfhood on the island. For these interactions provide a narrative framework in which questions of loyalty, trust, and moral responsibility are foregrounded, and where the practical necessities of exploration, combat, and resource management intersect with deeply personal ethical considerations, as the player must navigate the tension between assisting her in recovering lost memories, uncovering the truth about her origins, and respecting her autonomy, while also balancing the broader consequences of intervention for multiple factions of Far Harbor, including Acadia, the Harbormen, and the Children of Atom. And in this process, Kasumi becomes both a mirror and a catalyst for examining the philosophical and ethical dimensions of synthetic life, memory implantation, and the nature of selfhood in a post-apocalyptic world where human and synthetic existence are intertwined, contested, and morally charged. The search for Kasumi's identity is complicated by the layered and sometimes conflicting narratives of her past. For the Institute's memory implantation protocols, her own subjective recollections, and the interpretations of intermediaries such as Dimmer create a web of uncertainty, ambiguity, and moral challenge, in which the distinction between authentic and constructed memory becomes blurred, and in which every decision regarding disclosure, concealment, or manipulation carries consequences for both Kasumi and the surrounding communities, producing a moral and psychological landscape in which the recovery of selfhood is inseparable from negotiation, trust, and ethical reflection, and where the interplay between personal autonomy, external control, and environmental context shapes the practical and philosophical realities of existence on Far Harbor. Kasumi's presence on the island also intersects with the operational and ethical frameworks established by Acadia. For Dimmer's efforts to protect synths and preserve autonomy provide both opportunity and constraint, as her integration into the settlement depends upon her willingness to trust intermediaries, adhere to communal norms, and navigate the delicate balance between secrecy and safety, and her journey highlights the ongoing tension between freedom, protection, and ethical responsibility that defines Acadia's mission, illustrating how the preservation of life and identity requires both discretion and moral calculation, and how even acts of benevolence carry the weight of potential compromise, moral ambiguity, and the unintended consequences that are endemic to post-war survival, technological intervention, and environmental extremity. The relationship between Kasumi and the sole survivor also foregrounds the emotional and philosophical dimensions of the search for identity, for her experiences evoke questions regarding attachment, trust, and the ethical treatment of beings whose sentience and personhood are socially contested, and these questions are intensified by the island's extremities, the ideological pressures of the Harbormen and the Children of Atom, and the omnipresent threat of the fog, which functions both as an environmental hazard and a symbolic representation of uncertainty, mutation, and ethical ambiguity. And in this context, the restoration of memory, the assertion of autonomy, and the navigation of moral and existential dilemmas become intertwined, producing a narrative in which personal agency, ethical responsibility, and survival are inseparable, and where the recovery of identity is both a personal achievement and a communal negotiation that implicates every faction, every decision, and every technological or environmental variable present on the island. Kasumi's story ultimately illuminates the broader philosophical and moral questions that permeate Far Harbor, for her journey underscores the ethical implications of synthetic creation, memory implantation, and autonomy, raising questions about responsibility, consent, and the nature of selfhood in a landscape defined by environmental extremity, ideological contestation, and technological intervention, and her experiences provide a humanized lens, through which the consequences of institutional power, technological ambition, and moral pragmatism can be examined, illustrating the ways in which individual agency, survival, and ethical reasoning intersect in a post-apocalyptic context, and how the pursuit of identity, truth, and autonomy is inseparable from the negotiation of complex social, technological, and environmental realities, producing a narrative in which personal and collective survival, ethical responsibility, and existential inquiry converge in the fog, shrouded, irradiated, and morally contested spaces of Far Harbor. In conclusion, Kasumi Nakano embodies the intersection of identity, autonomy, and ethical responsibility on Far Harbor. For her search for selfhood is simultaneously a personal odyssey, a philosophical inquiry, and a practical negotiation with environmental hazard, ideological pressure, and technological contingency. And through her experiences, the complex interplay of human and synthetic life, memory, moral responsibility, and post-war survival is rendered tangible, providing a narrative through which the consequences of technological ambition, environmental extremity, and ethical ambiguity are explored, and demonstrating that the struggle to define oneself, assert autonomy, and navigate moral complexity is inseparable from the broader dynamics of survival, ideology, and technological mediation that define the island, and that in Far Harbor, the pursuit of identity is simultaneously a journey of survival, ethical reflection, and the assertion of personhood in a world in which every choice, action, and memory carries profound consequence. The fog that envelops the island of Far Harbor serves not only as an environmental hazard, but also as a symbolic and practical medium through which moral, strategic, and existential decisions are confronted, forcing every individual, community, and technological actor on the island to navigate a landscape in which survival, ideology, and ethical responsibility intersect, and where the consequences of choices reverberate across social, ecological, and political domains. For the player, assuming the role of the sole survivor is presented with a series of dilemmas that highlight the complexity and contingency of post-apocalyptic governance, and which require an acute awareness of the interplay between competing factions, environmental hazards, and the lives and autonomy of both human and synthetic populations. And through these decisions, the narrative foregrounds the profound challenges of moral and pragmatic judgment in a context defined by scarcity, hazard, and the collision of faith and reason, illustrating that every action, whether overt or subtle, carries consequences that extend beyond immediate tactical or strategic outcomes, shaping both the material and ethical landscape of Far Harbor. Central to these choices is the relationship between the Harbormen, the children of Atom, and Acadia, for the balance of power on the island is fragile, contingent upon diplomacy, environmental management, and the strategic deployment of resources such as the fog condensers, and any intervention by the sole survivor has the potential to alter the equilibrium, producing cascading effects that impact survival, territorial control, and ideological influence. And the player's decisions in this context range from acts of mediation and negotiation to tactical aggression or strategic deception, each path reflecting a particular moral calculus, whether oriented toward pragmatism, idealism, or personal interest, and each producing ramifications that challenge assumptions about right, wrong, and the ethical management of life in a post-apocalyptic ecosystem where human ambition, faith, and technology converge. The potential for peace among the island's factions presents a unique ethical and practical challenge, for it requires balancing respect for the Harbormen's traditions and survival strategies, the Children of Atom's deeply held theological beliefs, and Acadia's mission to protect synths while minimizing conflict. And the achievement of such equilibrium depends upon careful negotiation, strategic insight, and the capacity to anticipate both immediate and long-term consequences, requiring the sole survivor to engage in an adaptive moral calculus in which compromise, communication, and foresight are as critical as firepower or technological intervention, and where the ethical imperative to preserve life intersects with the strategic necessity of maintaining order, demonstrating that peace is not merely the absence of violence but a dynamic process of negotiation, observation, and intervention, in which the consequences of action and inaction are intertwined, contingent, and morally significant. Alternatively, the choice to pursue annihilation, whether through direct confrontation with the Children of Atom, the Harbormen, or the destabilization of Acadia, represents a morally and strategically consequential path, highlighting the potential costs of absolutism, ideology, and unilateral action, and illustrating the fragility of social, ecological, and technological systems in an environment already stressed by radioactive hazards, scarcity, and mutation, and such decisions underscore the ethical weight of destructive choice, demonstrating how attempts to impose order through coercion or force can produce unintended consequences, including ecological disruption, loss of life, and long-term destabilization, while simultaneously revealing the tension between survival imperatives and moral responsibility, and the necessity of considering the broader consequences of action in a landscape where human, synthetic, and environmental factors are inseparable and mutually influential. The potential for manipulation, particularly through the deployment of knowledge, secrecy, and strategic intervention, further complicates the ethical terrain of the island. Fadima's hidden agendas, the selective disclosure of information, and the calculated orchestration of events illustrate the ways in which moral responsibility can be diffused, deferred, or concentrated, producing scenarios in which the player's choices must account for both visible and invisible consequences. For the effects of intervention may extend far beyond immediate outcomes, shaping the psychological, social, and ecological dynamics of the island in ways that challenge conventional frameworks of justice, fairness, and ethical accountability, and where the interplay between intent, outcome, and perception becomes central to understanding both responsibility and legitimacy in a post-apocalyptic context. Environmental hazard, embodied in the fog, and its interaction with the island's ecology and populations, compounds the ethical and strategic stakes of choice. For every action, from the placement or activation of condensers to the management of contaminated zones, impacts both survival and moral responsibility, creating scenarios in which the preservation of life, the protection of autonomy, and the mitigation of harm must be weighed against the practical limitations imposed by environmental extremity, technological uncertainty, and resource scarcity. And in this context, the sole survivor's capacity to anticipate, observe, and respond to dynamic conditions becomes a measure of both ethical acumen and strategic competence, and the consequences of decision-making are immediate, tangible, and often irreversible, demonstrating that survival in Far Harbor is inseparable from the integration of moral judgment, technological skill, and environmental literacy. The multiplicity of choices also foregrounds questions of identity, memory, and agency, particularly in relation to synths such as Kasumi Nakano and the broader population of Acadia, for the player's decisions have direct implications for the autonomy, protection, and moral recognition of sentient beings, whose status is socially contested and whose survival depends upon careful negotiation, protection from ideological coercion, and ethical consideration. And in this way, the player's moral agency extends beyond traditional notions of human social responsibility, encompassing questions of synthetic personhood, ethical stewardship, and the management of life in conditions of uncertainty and hazard, and the resulting dilemmas illustrate the broader philosophical and practical questions of moral authority, intervention, and accountability that are central to the Fallout universe and to the lived experience of Far Harbor in particular. The consequences of choice in the fog are therefore multi-layered, encompassing immediate survival, long-term social stability, ecological preservation, ideological negotiation, and ethical responsibility. And every decision carries a network of potential outcomes that intersect, amplify, or conflict, producing scenarios in which the player must navigate both visible and hidden consequences, and where the moral and practical stakes are inseparable, contingent, and complex, requiring both foresight and adaptability, courage and restraint, and a capacity to integrate diverse forms of knowledge, observation, and ethical reasoning. And in this way, the moral landscape of Far Harbor is a reflection of both environmental extremity and human contingency, and the fog itself becomes a medium through which agency, consequence, and ethical deliberation are enacted, shaping the lived reality of every inhabitant, faction, and technological actor on the island. Ultimately, the choices confronted by the sole survivor in Far Harbor illustrate the interplay between survival, ideology, and moral responsibility in a post-apocalyptic landscape, demonstrating that every intervention, whether conciliatory, destructive, or manipulative, carries material, social, and ethical weight, and that the long-term fate of communities, ecosystems, and individual beings depends upon the careful integration of foresight, observation, and judgment, in which environmental mastery, ethical reasoning, and strategic calculation converge, and where the consequences of choice extend far beyond immediate tactical objectives, shaping the moral, social, and ecological terrain of the island in ways that are both tangible and symbolic, producing a narrative in which human, synthetic, and environmental agency are inseparable, and in which the ultimate lesson of Far Harbor is that survival is always contingent upon ethical discernment, strategic foresight, and the recognition of the profound and lasting consequences of every action in a morally and environmentally complex world. The fate of Far Harbor is inextricably linked to the choices, actions, and interventions of its inhabitants and visitors, and the consequences of those decisions reverberate through the island's fragile ecosystems, contested territories, and ideologically charged communities, producing multiple potential futures that reflect both the resilience and vulnerability of human and synthetic populations in a post-apocalyptic environment. For the island exists as a microcosm in which survival, belief, and technological mastery intersect with environmental extremity, and where the long-term viability of communities depends upon the delicate negotiation of power, morality, and practical necessity, and the outcomes that emerge are conditioned by the interplay of human agency, synthetic autonomy, ideological persistence, and environmental contingency, demonstrating that Far Harbor is simultaneously a landscape of opportunity, risk, and moral consequence, in which every action shapes the trajectory of both living beings and the ecosystem itself, and in which the narrative of survival is inseparable from the negotiation of ideological, technological, and ecological constraints. One possible trajectory involves the establishment of peace and coexistence between the Harbormen, the children of Atom, and Acadia, a resolution achieved through careful negotiation, ethical foresight, and strategic deployment of technological resources, such as the fog condensers, and through the mediation of intermediaries such as Dimmer and the sole survivor, whose intervention aligns competing interests without privileging one ideology over another, producing a dynamic in which environmental hazard, resource scarcity, and ideological difference are managed through cooperation, adaptation, and mutual recognition, and in which the moral and practical capacities of each faction are balanced against the broader imperative of survival, allowing the island's ecosystems, social structures, and ideological communities to persist, adapt, and stabilize, illustrating that even in the most extreme post-war contexts, human and synthetic agency, ethical judgment, and technological mastery can produce outcomes in which coexistence, resilience, and sustainability are achievable, contingent upon continuous attention, negotiation, and moral awareness. Alternatively, the fate of the island may be shaped by the collapse or domination of one faction over others, a scenario in which the children of Atom assert theological authority through coercion, or in which the Harbormen impose strict territorial and survival imperatives without regard for ideological diversity, or in which Acadia's synthetic inhabitants are threatened, displaced, or destroyed, producing a landscape in which survival is achieved at the cost of autonomy, diversity, and ethical consideration, and where environmental mastery is leveraged to enforce social and ideological control rather than to sustain collective resilience. And in this scenario, the island becomes a testament to the dangers of absolutism, ideological rigidity, and unilateral technological intervention, and the consequences of such domination reverberate through the ecosystem, population structures, and moral framework of the island, illustrating that survival achieved through coercion or suppression carries both ethical and practical costs, and may undermine the long-term viability of both human and synthetic communities. The technological interventions introduced to the island, including the fog condensers and the manipulation of contaminated zones, play a critical role in determining these outcomes, for their operation or disruption can alter territorial control, resource access, and the relative security of factions. And in doing so, technology becomes both a material and moral instrument, mediating the balance of power, shaping ethical consequences, and influencing the trajectory of the island's ecological and social systems, and the deployment, maintenance, or sabotage of these devices illustrates that technological mastery is inseparable from both ethical responsibility and strategic foresight, and that the failure or success of technological intervention produces consequences that extend far beyond immediate material benefits, affecting survival, ideological influence, and ecological stability, and demonstrating that the fate of Far Harbor is contingent upon the careful integration of knowledge, foresight, and ethical reasoning in the context of extreme environmental hazard. The presence of synthetic inhabitants and the moral dilemmas associated with their autonomy further complicates the potential futures of the island, for decisions regarding protection, integration, or exposure of synth populations, including Kasumi Nakano and the broader community of Acadia, carry ethical weight and strategic consequence, influencing both factional dynamics and social cohesion, and illustrating that survival is inseparable from recognition of autonomy, moral responsibility, and the ethical management of life, whether human or artificial, and that the outcomes for Far Harbor depend not only upon the balance of power among traditional human factions, but upon the capacity of human actors to negotiate ethical obligations towards synthetic life in a landscape defined by environmental extremity, ideological conflict, and technological contingency, producing a spectrum of potential futures in which moral reasoning and strategic foresight determine the durability, fairness, and resilience of social and ecological systems. The long-term ecological consequences of factional decisions and technological intervention are also significant. For the manipulation of the fog, the management of radiation, and the exploitation of natural resources such as fish stocks, mutated flora, and pre-war artifacts directly impact the viability of the island's ecosystems, shaping the abundance, diversity, and behavior of both natural and mutated species, and influencing the material conditions of survival for human and synthetic populations alike. And in this context, every action that affects the environment carries both ethical and practical significance, creating a feedback loop in which environmental mastery, technological intervention, and moral responsibility are inseparable, and where the sustainability of the island's population, infrastructure, and ideology is contingent upon ongoing observation, adaptation, and ethical engagement with the natural and post-apocalyptic landscape, ensuring that Far Harbor's fate is always dynamic, contingent, and morally resonant. The ideological dimension of the island's future is equally critical. For the persistence, compromise, or collapse of belief systems among the children of Atom, the Harbormen, and Acadia shapes social cohesion, moral authority, and the legitimacy of power, and influences the willingness of populations to glow, cooperate, accept mediation, or resist intervention. And in this sense, ideology functions not only as a spiritual or philosophical framework, but as a practical determinant of survival and social organization, mediating the interactions between technology, environment, and ethical choice, and reinforcing the principle that post-apocalyptic resilience requires both material competence and moral acuity, in which the integration of belief, practice, and environmental mastery determines both the capacity to survive and the ethical quality of that survival, producing a dynamic in which the fate of the island is inseparable from the negotiation of faith, pragmatism, and ethical foresight. In conclusion, the fate of Far Harbor is not a singular outcome, but a contingent and morally charged spectrum of possibilities, reflecting the interaction of survival imperatives, ideological commitment, technological mastery, ecological constraints, and the ethical responsibilities of both human and synthetic actors. And the ultimate trajectory of the island demonstrates that resilience, adaptation, and coexistence are achievable only through careful negotiation, ethical reflection, and strategic intervention, while domination, coercion, or neglect produce consequences that compromise both moral legitimacy and ecological viability. And in this way, Far Harbor stands as a post-apocalyptic microcosm in which the long-term sustainability of life, belief, and society depends upon the continuous integration of observation, skill, judgment, and moral awareness, and in which the choices made by a few capable actors can reverberate across generations, shaping the physical, social, and ethical contours of the island and ensuring that the ultimate fate of Far Harbor is simultaneously material, moral, and contingent upon the integration of knowledge, foresight, and responsibility in a landscape defined by fog, mutation, ideology, and human and synthetic ambition. The legacy of Far Harbor is woven from the intertwined threads of environmental extremity, ideological conflict, technological ingenuity, and human and synthetic agency, creating a narrative that extends far beyond the immediate drama of survival to encompass reflections on faith, identity, morality, and the consequences of human ambition. For the island's enduring significance lies not merely in its geographic isolation or radioactive hazards, but in the ways in which its history, social structures, and ecological peculiarities illuminate the broader human struggle to reconcile belief, reason, and ethical responsibility in the aftermath of societal collapse. And in this sense, Far Harbor functions as both a physical space and a conceptual arena in which the complexities of post-apocalyptic existence, the persistence of faith, and the adaptability of human and artificial life can be examined in tandem, revealing enduring truths about the fragility, resilience, and moral contours of civilization in extremis, and demonstrating that even the most isolated or inhospitable environments are subject to the pressures of ideology, technology, and ethical decision-making, producing consequences that ripple across communities, ecosystems, and generations. Central to this legacy is the tension between isolation and connection, for Far Harbor is at once a remote, fog-shrouded island, physically separated from the Commonwealth and other post-war settlements, and yet it is deeply connected to broader narratives of human ambition, technological experimentation, and ethical inquiry, reflecting the ways in which isolated spaces serve as crucibles for testing the limits of survival, belief, and moral responsibility, and where the arrival of the sole survivor and the intervention of figures such as Dimmer and Kasumi Nakano highlight the permeability of boundaries, both social and ethical, and the ways in which external actors can reshape the trajectory of communities, ecological, systems, and ideological frameworks. And in doing so, the island becomes a lens through which the broader Fallout mythos interrogates questions of agency, consequence, and the ethical dimensions of post-apocalyptic survival, illustrating that isolation does not preclude responsibility, influence, or moral engagement, and that even the most remote and extreme environments are inseparable from the network of human and technological action. The ideological legacies of the Children of Atom, the Harbormen, and Acadia are equally critical to understanding the lasting impact of Far Harbor, for the persistence, evolution, or collapse of these belief systems shapes both the moral and material contours of the island, producing consequences that extend to social cohesion, governance, and the management of environmental hazards, and illustrating that ideology is inseparable from survival, technological practice, and ecological stewardship, as the doctrines, customs, and organizational structures of each community mediate interactions with the fog, the radioactive landscape, and other factions, producing outcomes that are both tangible and symbolic, and in which faith, pragmatism, and technological mastery converge to define the possibilities of resilience, cooperation, and adaptation, And the legacy of these ideological struggles is preserved not only in the actions of living communities, but in the material traces of belief, from the nucleus and its rituals to Acadia's synth sanctuaries, to the cultural and technical practices of the Harbormen, forming a complex web of memory, moral reasoning, and environmental management that continues to inform the trajectory of life on the island. Technological and environmental legacies also define the enduring significance of Far Harbor. For innovations such as the fog condensers, the management of radiation, and the adaptation to mutated flora and fauna illustrate the capacity of human ingenuity to mediate extreme environmental hazards and simultaneously reveal the ethical and strategic stakes of such interventions. As control over these systems influences survival, social authority, and ecological integrity, and shapes the balance of power among competing factions, demonstrating that technology is not neutral but deeply embedded in both ethical and ideological frameworks, and that mastery of material systems carries consequences that are both practical and moral, with failures or misapplications producing cascading effects on population, habitat, and the island's broader ecological and social systems. And in this way, the material artifacts of ingenuity become enduring markers of human adaptation, moral deliberation, and strategic foresight, forming an inseparable component of Far Harbor's legacy. The personal and existential narratives that unfold on Far Harbor, particularly those of figures such as Kasumi Nakano and the Sole Survivor, contribute to the island's legacy by foregrounding the consequences of memory, identity, and agency in a post-apocalyptic context. For the ethical, emotional, and philosophical questions raised by synthetic life, autonomy, and the reconstruction of selfhood resonate across the social and ecological fabric of the island, highlighting the intersection of technology, morality, and survival, and illustrating that the legacies of Far Harbor are not merely structural or ideological, but profoundly personal, shaping the ways in which beings, both human and synthetic, understand themselves, relate to others, and exercise agency in conditions of extreme constraint and uncertainty, and ensuring that the moral, psychological, and existential dimensions of survival are preserved as a central component of the island's enduring narrative. The fate of Far Harbor's natural and mutated environments further reinforces its legacy. For the persistence of mutated species, the management of radiation, and the adaptation of flora and fauna to fog conditions demonstrate the complex interplay between human activity, ideological practice, and ecological resilience, and highlight the ways in which survival in extreme post-war landscapes necessitates both observation and ethical engagement with the material environment, producing a dynamic in which ecological knowledge, technological skill, and moral responsibility converge to shape the possibilities of long-term continuity and ensuring that the legacy of the island encompasses not only social and ideological dimensions, but also environmental, scientific, and adaptive achievements, illustrating that the human and synthetic inhabitants are inextricably linked to the ecological systems they inhabit, manage, and transform, and that their actions leave enduring marks upon the landscape, the species it sustains, and the cultural memory that persists beyond immediate survival. In the final analysis, Far Harbor's legacy is a reflection of the broader themes of the Fallout mythos, encapsulating the tensions between faith and reason, isolation and connection, technology and ecology, autonomy and dependence, and the moral and existential challenges of survival in a post-apocalyptic world. and the island functions as both a cautionary tale and a site of possibility, illustrating the consequences of ideological rigidity, technological overreach, and environmental neglect, while simultaneously demonstrating the potential for adaptation, negotiation, and ethical engagement. And the enduring significance of Far Harbor lies not in any single event, faction, or technology, but in the constellation of interactions, decisions, and adaptations that define life on the island, producing a layered narrative in which survival, belief, and responsibility are inseparable, and where the moral, ecological, and technological consequences of human and synthetic action are preserved, studied, and reflected upon, ensuring that Far Harbor remains a distinctive locus for understanding the interplay of post-apocalyptic survival, ideology, ethics, and environmental mastery. Ultimately, Far Harbor's legacy is one of complexity, resilience, and reflection, a testament to the ways in which human and synthetic actors negotiate identity, survival, and morality in a landscape defined by fog, radiation, and ideological contestation, and a reminder that isolation does not preclude ethical responsibility, technological challenge, or environmental consequence. For the decisions, actions, and adaptations of its inhabitants resonate far beyond the immediate horizon, producing lessons, legacies, and narratives that continue to inform both the fictional universe of Fallout and the broader understanding of human resilience, moral judgment, and the enduring struggle to navigate the uncertain, hazardous, and morally charged landscapes of post-apocalyptic existence. And in this, Far Harbor stands as a permanent monument to the capacity of belief, ingenuity, and ethical deliberation to shape the material and spiritual world, leaving a legacy that is both cautionary and inspirational, local and universal, temporal and enduring, and one that continues to define the intersection of survival, identity, faith, and reason in the Fallout mythos.